Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Iliff School of Theology and our third session of our series of We Advocate Freedom, a teach-in. I'm Lee Butler. I am the president of Iliff, and I am delighted that you have chosen to be here with us tonight, both in person and for our friends who are online. This is the third session of a six-part series. The first session talked about strategies toward effective social change. The second, why does this feel so complicated? Protests, ceasefire, two-state solutions. Tonight, we are discussing spirited and spiritual resistance, community chaplaincy, and religious leadership. The fourth session will be United Methodist social principles and the impact of socially responsible investments. And sessions 5 and 6 will focus on Dr. Angela Davis's book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Our first 4 sessions are hosting 3 guests, 3 panelists to be discussants with one another, to have conversation, to help us to think through the issues and dynamics of what it means to engage in protest and how we ought to understand the complex and complicated issues that we are evaluating and experiencing as it relates to the state of Israel and Palestine and the activities of Gaza. The last 2 will be individual conversations. I will be having conversations with 2 persons where we will begin by talking about Dr. Davis's book, Freedom's a Constant Struggle. The first session of those 2 will be with Dr. Rami Nashashibi from Chicago, and the last session will be with Rabbi Joe Black of Denver. And so we are at that point reducing the number of persons who will be present, which will give us more opportunity to have conversation. So these first 4 sessions are lots of information. The last 2 are, now that you've had all the information, let's have intimate conversation with 2 persons. So tonight, we are having this conversation that's focusing on chaplaincy. Chaplaincy studies is an important part of what we do here at Iliff. Those of you who have been involved in chaplaincy studies know that there are 5 basic areas for thinking about, for engaging, for studying chaplaincy. And when I talked to Dr. Moon, he says, yeah, 5, but it's growing. The list is growing. So the 5 basic areas that I always lift up: hospital chaplaincy, which includes hospice; military, college or higher education; correctional, so we're talking about chaplains in prisons; and community chaplaincy. So these are the 5 basic areas where we will find chaplains who are engaging in the work of religious leadership and responding to spiritual issues that folks are experiencing. Iliff has been one of the leaders in chaplaincy studies. The late Dr. Larry Kent Graham, and our newly retired emerita professor, Dr. Carrie Doring. They were a phenomenal team that engaged in chaplaincy studies and led Iliff into that world and established Iliff as a significant leader in chaplaincy studies. They engaged in both military, chaplaincy, and community. Some of you may not be aware that they both were involved in trying to help the community, the families of Columbine, to navigate, negotiate, and to really deal with all the grief that they were carrying. So Iliff has been a leader in both military and community chaplaincy. As I have taught spiritual care, pastoral care, and those fundamental skills that a chaplain will employ, we're talking about being interreligious. We're talking about engaging in crises and working to engage in prevention, crisis management, crisis intervention. This is the work that chaplains engage in. And so tonight we have 3 chaplains who will share with us and engage us with their work in the context of chaplaincy. So we have Chaplain Leenah Safi. She is a chaplain at Yale University. She is Muslima, and she will share with us from that context and how she came to chaplaincy, which is a very interesting story. We have Dr. Zachary Moon, who is the professor of theology and psychology at Chicago Theological Seminary. But Dr. Moon is also coming home because he is a graduate of the JDP. And we have Rabbi Steve Booth-Nadav, who is a chaplain here in Denver. He has been a congregational rabbi, and he is engaged in Jewish spirituality, Jewish wilderness spirituality guide, death education, and a chaplain in a community. Here it is. Is it kabod or kavod? Kavod. Think. Honor your mother and your father. Senior life. So he's been a chaplain in that community for 12 years. So I invite each of these chaplains to come forward to take a seat, and we will move into our conversation. Hopefully that you will have had an opportunity to read their bios in a more extensive way. And I am really going to invite them to say more about who they are, what they do, that they will introduce themselves. That's something that's very important to do. So by way of a brief introduction, say a word about where you enter into this conversation tonight and the importance of chaplaincy when we are living in these very challenging times. So a word of brief introduction, where you enter into this conversation, and something about chaplaincy that will help us to have a better understanding of what it means to be a chaplain in times like this. And whoever wants to begin.
So I'll go ahead. Firstly, thank you so much, President Butler, for this wonderful invitation to be here with you all. Anytime I have a chance to come to Denver, I always say yes. And certainly to be here at home with you all is such a pleasure. a point of privilege as well. President Butler is my first teacher in pastoral care. So this is just a particular kind of tender honor that I really appreciate. Increasingly, I've been thinking about chaplaincy as the willingness to experience institutional complexity with another or with a group of others. Yeah, maybe I'd unpack that later, but that's the first thing that came to mind.
So one piece maybe that makes sense by way of introduction is before being here at Iliff to work on a PhD and before teaching in Chicago, I worked for a number of years as a military chaplain. And so one of the sort of lenses to think about this very particular set of conditions that we're speaking of tonight as it relates to chaplaincy, or as chaplaincy perhaps could be a resource of sorts. My own experience and formation as a chaplain in the midst of a space that was by its very nature a militarized space, a space in which bodies were very purposefully weaponized for very particular political reasons vis-a-vis our foreign policy. And yet also the military is this remarkable multicultural, interreligious space. And so to do ministry in a space that was simultaneously all of this beautiful human complexity, but also very much inscribed by a certain rationale of violence, is on my mind a little bit when we start thinking about how do we turn toward some of the questions maybe that we'll talk about tonight.
Good evening. I feel I need to introduce myself a little bit more in order to respond to the question. Having lived and worked in Jerusalem, having built relationships with Palestinians in Israel, on the West Bank and in Gaza, having led tours in Gaza, having maintained relationships over decades, having two Palestinian citizens of Israel goddaughters, I don't bring the scholarship that my colleagues here do, but I bring a wealth of experiences to share. Half of my 32-year career so far as a rabbi was spent as a congregational rabbi, where, among many other things, I officiated at hundreds of life cycle events from birth to death and everything in between. And I mention that because that's part of what led me to chaplaincy, was being present for people both in the joyful moments of their lives and in the more difficult moments of their lives. When I transitioned to chaplaincy about 12 years ago, I became the chaplain at Kavod Senior Life here in Denver, which I describe as a Jewishly hosted, multi-faith, affordable housing community for seniors. I have to take a breath before I say that. I also run something called the Multi-Faith Leadership Forum of Metro Denver, a community of over 35 faith leaders in the Denver area. While studying as a seminary student in 87, 88, I developed extremely close relationships with 5 families in particular when I was living in Jerusalem. 2 Jewish, one originally from South Africa, one of Palestinian citizens of Israel who have lived for generations in the lower Galilee, one West Bank Palestinian who to this day runs the only school for peace in the West Bank, and one family in Gaza City. In the 1990s, I led 3 private free tours of the Gaza Strip, supported by UNRWA. So UNRWA's in the news a lot these days. I've been in their offices, I've worked with them. And an amazing woman who worked for Save the Children by the name of Mary Haas. May her memory be for a blessing. My friends, the Waba family, hosted me in Gaza City on several occasions. So the streets of Gaza, at least as they used to be, are not unfamiliar to me. Lastly, last May, I went on a listening tour, mostly in Israel, but also in the West Bank and Palestine, where I listened to Jews and Christians and Muslims in the wake of October 7th, the most murderous day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. That visit ended in the Arab village of Tarshiha with my goddaughter Noura and her family, 6 miles from the Lebanon border, which has survived near constant rocket fire for over a year. So I look forward to sharing my experiences and insights from what I call the emotional field of the conflict. And I feel like how I deal with chaplaincy is that that's my job, is to be a presence, hopefully be a non-anxious presence in the emotional field of whoever I'm with. And I'm doing that in the hopes of humanizing the situation a bit, and hoping that other political conversations, not tonight, but other political conversations can be more grounded in that human emotional experience. Let me put it that.
Thank you each. And so I want to lift up a few questions for each of you and give you an opportunity to really help us to think through some of these dynamics. And so I want to begin with the context of campus chaplaincy. Part of what informed the development of this conversation tonight was having a conversation with one of my colleagues at another institution who was sharing with me. This colleague is a seminary professor who is across the street from a major university. And that particular university had an encampment. And he said to me, "You probably didn't hear about the encampment at that university because the team of chaplains at that university came together and did work to mediate the conversation between the protesters who were encamped and the administration." And he was saying that it would be so wonderful if all of these campuses had active chaplains like that. So as you were engaged at Yale, what kinds of activities are going on, and how do you see chaplaincy could really benefit the conversations that could also serve those persons who are taking these stances to help them to see spirituality as a resource?
Thank you. I think it would be beneficial to share a little bit about my background, I think kind of segueing into that rich question. So my early formation happened at an Islamic liberal arts college in Berkeley, California, called Zaytuna College. I left home of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and for Berkeley, I was not yet 18, the youngest in my family, so this was a big deal for many reasons, but I was really glad to be in a different space and to just see the beautiful hills and the water. But I was also a part of the first cohort, so we had the kind of immense opportunity to be in classes with some of the foremost American Muslim leaders, as many Muslims would see it today. People I saw at conferences in front of 20 or 30,000 people in Chicago, or in like a major, Detroit, or a major kind of center like that. So to be in a small classroom with them meant, intense textual study. It meant learning kind of behaviorally what it looked like, or what it should look like, to kind of lead in this kind of prophetic way as Muslims understand it. After about 4 years of that, I was really ready for something that felt more practical. So that was ultimately what led me to Chicago Theological Seminary. But it was still kind of a pretty new idea in terms of Islamic chaplaincy. What does it mean? What are its resources? What are its sacred texts? What are its sources, right? So that has been the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years. This last year, however, being in the midst of doctoral study and comprehensive exams, I watched much of the encampments online and was reading about them kind of, virtually from my room. But what struck me was that those same kind of frameworks and questions about sources and what would be useful was the work of the dissertation itself, and it was the work that I had been looking for and had been struggling to find. So I'm very new at Yale. I've been there just for a couple of months. So I'm still learning about the way that the students are operating and the way that the university operates. But I already have heard and have sensed this real thirst and maybe sometimes frustration and agitation that our religious leaders aren't engaged with things that matter to students. And so that push is pretty intense. I was expecting it because I have felt it. So that was not off-putting to me, but I think I'm not sure that we're always quite listening to the tenor of that because it feels like it's pushing back on a lot of institutional, both in terms of university institutions, but also religious leadership more generally. So that would be, I think, some of my preliminary thoughts.
Okay. Dr. Moon, you mentioned military chaplaincy. And as I have looked at some of the images that have been broadcast, I am wondering, because we're not seeing it, I'm wondering what the role of a chaplain would be on the ground in that horrible space. Because I do see chaplains as persons who step into the fray. So what's the kind of work that a chaplain might be doing in Gaza today?
Yeah, there's, I think one of the one of those kind of necessary questions, chaplaincy in any context, is just to be sincere in your commitment to the undeniable dignity of another human being and allowing that to be all of the necessary guidance to you in that encounter. What does dignity of this person demand of my service to them? Any good answer is going to come from that question. And I think to say that chaplains are those who are willing to step into the fray is also a certain kind of estimation of proximity and relationship. And I think part of the greatest challenge for us here in the United States is, I would say, very different contours of relationship when it comes to those in the Holy Land and the tyranny of proximity or lack thereof. That the relevance of you being there in May is significant in terms of what's happening in that space in May. And it's been a few years since I've been there. So to say that you know streets that are not as they were is altogether significant to this question of what is a chaplain's work in that space. It it helps if you have courage to do that kind of hard work. But I also, how to say this, I've met some chaplains who thought it was all about being a adrenaline junkie, that like the fray was where they wanted to be all the time. And the closer they were to the heat, the more righteous, I suppose, they must be becoming, religiously speaking. And I guess I just want to try to refute that for a moment to say, that's not always what the service of human dignity requires of us. It's sometimes very quiet work, very slow work, very even imperceptible kind of work. But that's why tuning into that question around the dignity of another has to be so central to our thinking. An element of this as well, of course, is many of the institutional, governmental, organizational responses tend to consider the material needs or deficits happening in a particular situation. And the emphasis gets put on that. What's happening with aid? Is aid having the access? And these sorts of questions, which of course are altogether important. And yet, the horror of what is happening there is not only a matter of material and bodily needs. It is a horror that has begotten horror that has begotten horror that has begotten horror. And that would be a good place. That would be a fray that would be deserving of good chaplaincy. To be able to be present in that way, to be about the service of dignity in that space, and any other good resistance to the way in which violence can come back again and back again and back again, to imagine that there is a different future for any of our beloved siblings who dwell in the land would have to be, I think, one of the most audacious healing projects we've ever seen as a global community. And we would have to understand our work there not only as a matter of solidarity, but a matter of this kind of shared belonging and shared dignity that unfortunately, I think, continues to be obscured both by media representations and by certain political entities for their own benefit and at the expense of what human dignity would demand of us in its place. I actually think, President Butler, that probably where chaplains are needed the most, at least as it pertains to those of us here tonight, I mean, we need some good chaplains right here. The fray is right here. To imagine that this is something happening thousands of miles away is not the reality that I know. I know that this is touching people, impacting people in such profound ways right here. So some of what you've already begun to name in terms of what are these chaplains about? We could be about some good business right here. That healing project, I think at this point is actually a transnational, if not global, kind of project, not only a local or regional project. And that's something that I think all of us have a piece of or need to feel a sense of connection to, I hope, in some kind of meaningful way.
And that you said the work that has to happen here, I'm going to alert you to a question that I have for you, because I did want to bring it back. This is just an alert for you to talk about your role when you went to Standing Rock. And I want to lift that up because we haven't heard a lot of work being done by chaplains in the encampments as relates to the Gaza crisis, but we did hear about chaplains going to Standing Rock. So we're going to come back to you on that. And that'll put us back into the conversation around what's happening on campuses. But Rabbi Steve, the question I have for you really is about community chaplaincy, and the way I want to introduce the question, it also relates to something that you stated. Within theological education, there are lots of folks who enter programs, and they say, I'm here to be a chaplain because I don't want to be involved in a congregation. And so chaplaincy becomes this way of escaping congregational life. But what you identified is this kind of discernment, this growing understanding that led you into chaplaincy and a larger community. So what does it really mean to be a chaplain to a community and not simply a single congregation? Because you did talk about that even in the context of your life in Jerusalem and the different communities and neighborhoods, the family relationships that then go out into a broader context than just congregation. So what's the importance of really being a community chaplain?
Well, I never thought about, I think about the congregation I served here in Denver for 11 years and the community that I serve at Kavod Senior Life today. They're both communities. I don't really think about them in terms of difference, in terms of size or anything like that. What I love about the kind of community chaplaincy that I'm doing is that it is multi-faith. Is that, and one of the things that a chaplain has to do, you guys know this, is you have to be able to step into the spiritual space of anyone and be able to relate to them. And if their language is really different than yours, then you've got to figure out how do you get there while still being authentic to yourself. So I find that a spiritual challenge that I love. And I learn from people from different traditions than mine, not just in terms of their own experiences, which is also a lot, but I learn theological concepts that I didn't get as strongly. Sometimes, when somebody teaches me something from another faith tradition, I have to go, okay, do I have something like that in my tradition? And quite often the answer is yes. And then then it gets richer because now here's like a commentary on it. And other times I'm stretching to say that this is in my tradition, but I really like that idea. So it expands my spirituality. So I've been tremendously, I mean, first of all, I was tremendously gifted in my congregation to be there in those life cycle events I mentioned. That was probably the highlight of it. And now, you know, I had some years ago, a woman, she might have been a student here at one time, I don't know. She was a Christian feminist liturgist, and she came to my Torah study classes, and I learned a lot from her. It was great. And then she was in the hospital and she was dying. And the family knew about her relationship with me and asked me to come. And I called a colleague who won't be named and said, "Do you guys have like a final confessional prayer to you that I can use?" And he says, "Oh, probably it's in one of our books, but we don't use those things." He said, "I use what is in my heart at the time." This family, and I said to them, "Okay, so I've got my Jewish bed final confessional. I can, but it doesn't make sense here. This woman's not Jewish." And they said, "Mom loved you and she loved what you did, and she would love it if you would just do it your way." So now I still changed it a bit, but that was so powerful. And without going into the details, we did a ritual of forgiveness between family members and the person who was dying in both directions. And the woman who was dying was not awake, her eyes were not open. And at a certain point, as we were offering forgiveness, tears started coming from her eyes. And I realized, oh my God, she can hear us. This is impacting her for real. I can't tell you how much that expands my sense of the spiritual as a rabbi. To be able to be in a context like that with somebody where I'm just trying to figure out how do I navigate this between our worlds. So that's what I get out of it. Yeah.
But in your correspondence with me, by way of Amanda, you also named being, I think it was in Jerusalem during the first Intifada. What did it mean to be on the ground as a rabbi then?
I'm sorry.
And to be in community, in neighborhoods with people who are struggling with life and death issues.
Yeah, I mean, I was a student back then, so I would, if I can speak more to my recent experience.
Sure.
Everywhere I went, I mean, you started to refer to this. I mean, the emotional field of the country is trauma. Everybody's traumatized. Some people are hiding it better than others, but everybody's traumatized. And I'm on a train going to Jerusalem, and a young soldier asks me, what am I doing here? And I got asked that a lot. What are you doing here? What they're saying is, we're traumatized. We're scared out of our minds. We have no idea what tomorrow is going to bring. And the world hates us and is isolating us. So what are you doing here? It's like, we can't pick. Why would you come into the middle of this mess to be with us? So when you mention affirming human dignity, so I felt like my job going around the country as I listened to survivors of October 7th, from the kibbutzim around Gaza and from other places, I felt that my job was to be affirming their human dignity. And a lot of that, as you were just saying, was showing up. Just showing up and listening and not judging. have some dear friends of mine, their daughter, we were talking about intergenerational households. So this other family of mine, their daughter and her husband and their 2 kids have moved in with them. And I haven't seen this young woman, Carmel, in 9 years. And I walk into her house and she says, she said 2 things to me that I didn't quite know what to make of what she meant. She said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Do you understand what we're going through, what's happening here?" And it took me a while to realize what she was saying was, this situation is so terrifying that for you to come to this of your own choice, just for the heck of it, you've either got to be ignorant or crazy. And she meant it. You've got to be ignorant or crazy to come here. But I think every time in any of these situations that people show up, affirming the human dignity of the other, affirming, I'm just another human being like you. And yes, I will come here and be with you. You are not alone. Means a lot. So I assume similarly, the Waba family that used to host me in Gaza City, I've lost touch with them in recent years. I know most of their kids left the country. And back in December, I suddenly realized, oh my God, the parents might still be in Gaza City. And I was horrified. I just thought, are they alive? I started searching death rolls. And long story short, I located them in Amman, Jordan. And I called them on WhatsApp. And I just have to hope that that phone call from years ago, it's been years since we've talked to each other, meant something to them, that I actually cared enough to find them and to call them and make sure they were okay.
Thank you. So Chaplain Moon, I prompted you about your time at Standing Rock, and I wanted to use that as a transition back to campus ministry, because that was an encampment. And chaplains were showing up. Showing up to do what?
Yeah, I hope that some of my experience there, and again, some of you here tonight may have had your own participation in that important site of work and the continuation of that work. When I was invited to come, it was to serve in a chaplain role, and there were many people who were going to Standing Rock for sort of different kind of specific events or occasions. There were folks who had been there for months and months and months. So there were a lot of layers to that community. But there had been some community organizing that had specifically sought American military veterans to come together en masse to be at Standing Rock. And one of those, sort of thank God moments was somebody figured out that that was a profoundly precarious thing, just on a chemistry level. And so started working the networks and said, hey, we actually need some folks who know how to work with military veterans to be here in this kind of particular way. And it's also worth saying, because I think this certainly pertains to other kinds of protest movement spaces, is that there are good things for religious leaders to be doing. Just because you are a religious leader doesn't mean that you are a chaplain. And there were a number of religious leaders from many different backgrounds who were a part of the activism that was happening around Standing Rock. When I got there, I found out they had they had done some good things and they had done maybe some sort of miscalculated things. And one of the things that I think was overestimated by some religious leaders was they thought, oh, you know, I'm special because I got this kind of clergy status or this religious leader status, and that's going to sort of mean something on a kind of identity level. But it also became really clear that those folks were showing up in more activist role and responsibilities. And so I think being really deliberate about our sense of what it means to be in a protest movement space as a chaplain necessitates some different ways of being than it would be for other folk. And it was a remarkable time to be there. The team of chaplains who came utterly unprepared for what was going on there. Really, only God's mercy allowed us to do the good work there, because the chemistry was far more volatile than anyone had anticipated. I mean, they had anticipated the danger of volatility enough to invite some of us to be there. But the reality was Standing Rock was already a space that had been impacted many times over by violent encounters with a militarized police force. It was a traumatized space, and what was bringing this particular cadre of military veterans who didn't necessarily know each other, the thing that they shared in common was their own respective trauma histories. So part of the volatility was the mobilization of traumatized bodies entering into a traumatized space with a sense of mission. The military folks, by and large, who came were coming with the intention to serve as bodily shields between the militarized police and the water protectors. One most vivid moment was medical corpsmen, the folks who do the kind of medical care within the military, said to a group of us, I brought this pack of 60 pounds of medical equipment and I intend to use it. But some of what that moment was about was realizing the ways that complex trauma and often our desperate attempt to experience something heroic or even reparative at a soul level was what had compelled many of these folks to be there. That the mission was, if I could bleed in protection of the water protectors, my soul could experience some redemption in the aftermath of my military service.
Mm-hmm.
And what became very volatile was how that was expressing itself was, we're here looking for confrontation. We're here looking to bleed. We're here looking for redemption. And we will have it. And so the fray of that moment was all about that. Because the people who had a long-term relationship with that encampment, with that land, with that project, were desperate to not see that kind of escalation take place. And in fact, the moment, those days, those weeks as they were unfolding was actually time where where real progress was being made. And actually, a bunch of American military vets showing up at Standing Rock kind of tipped the scales in a really positive way, because some of our government officials didn't like the optics of what it would look like to have this military police attack military veterans. So them being there from a strategic organizing perspective was incredibly important. It made a profound contribution. And it wasn't what most of them had come there for.
Hmm.
So the work of chaplaincy in that space was to have the kind of engagement with folks that allowed for those deep soul longings to be heard and acknowledged and dignified, and also for some some necessary reframing and orienting around what was actually happening there. Because to experience trauma is often to experience or perceive a reality that isn't always lined up with what's happening in your environment. Or your environment is kind of activating stuff inside of you that often makes things very challenging. A lot more to say about that experience.
Okay.
However,
Yeah.
I think some of what I would hope we could relate to when we've seen some of the energy at campuses across this country is the way in which chaplains can inhabit a third space, a third way, a way that is neither complying with the institutional power way of approaching things, nor is it as energized by the kind of vigor of activism. Activism itself can take on a real psychic and emotional and spiritual roller coaster with a lot of really intense energy, a lot of sense of connection and belonging and purpose. This is important. It's important to be here. It's important that we're here together. I've had those experiences as an activist. They've had a deep impact on me. And there's also this terrible thing that can happen in the wake of that good, connected, energized feel that we're doing something important together. And it's what often keeps our movements from being effective in the long term, because we can't sustain that amount of adrenaline in our body system. So at some point, our bodies just start quitting on us. Or sometimes it starts playing out as interpersonal strife. Oh, I thought I was in it. I thought this guy was for real. I thought he really cared. But now I think he's a sellout. And I feel betrayed by what's happening here. I'm going to grab my stuff and I'm going to go home. And that sense of betrayal, that sense of I was here with this really thick, meaningful, purposeful kind of way of being here, and it didn't happen the way I thought it was going to happen. And now what I feel is betrayal. I feel maybe at best let down or disappointed or frustrated. But if a chaplain was hanging out in that space, a chaplain would acknowledge that, would say, hey, I know y'all are riding the fast train right now, but it can't keep up like this. What does it look like to sustain ourselves? If this work is important, then we actually got to figure out how to do the long work, not just the quick, loud work. What's the long work look like? And a lot of activists have never really engaged with that question before, because frankly, what compels a lot of us into activist work is that kind of immediacy. It is that energy. It is that outrage that moves us into action. But that's not a everyday, week after week, month after month. Relationships are the things that ultimately are going to be sustaining for us. It's going to be where our accountability comes from. It's going to be where we share our sadness and our grief and our disappointment, our heartbreak, our anguish. Good chaplains ask questions about that.
Okay.
Who's your people? Where's your support? How's this going to look? Those kinds of support systems actually have an opportunity to unlock our justice activism in a next level kind of way. And again, I feel like Standing Rock gave us a little bit of a sense of both the need for those kinds of presences, and also a sense of hopefulness that if our activism was accompanied.
So let's pull this back down the line and back to the campus context. And psychiatrist Frantz Fanon had an article that he entitled Concerning Violence. And he really talked about violence in such a way to say that it is the natural outcome, and in some ways, violence is what brings about transformation. We've witnessed on many campuses how peace became violent. And again, we haven't seen a lot of chaplains in those roles, but one of the things Dr. Moon just said was there were chaplains who were ready to throw their bodies between the militarized police and the water protectors. There have been times when we've had on these campuses folks who have thrown their bodies between a militarized police and protesters. Again, chaplains on campus with the threat of violence constantly. What can happen as a chaplain?
Gosh, part of me wants to say anything can happen. Another part of me wants to say, I think there is so much tension around what the goal of chaplaincy is in higher education and on our campuses currently. So I think there's this real tension of chaplains operating as staff. And so that comes with a level of sometimes mistrust from the students. If the students feel that the administration is not on their side on any given issue. And this is this last year. I saw that as well in my work at the University of Michigan some years ago. And I think chaplains occupy also this unique element of being able to speak to faith and to sacred text that sometimes is a little mystifying for university administration at times too. So there's this might understand what a pastor does. I kind of understand what you all do, but it's student facing. So, we want the students to be happy. So there is this kind of, maybe tendency to lean on chaplains to do a little bit of the placating. So I think there's some real tension there. As is common when caring for Muslims and in my own faith life, I wanted to turn to the Quran to kind of better understand what is both what is at stake here, but also what is what Quranic stories might be drawn from to kind of speak to this difficult moment, and particularity as families are fighting, right? Even here, there's lots of conflict amongst families about this issue in the Middle East. And my dissertation touches on this concept of formation in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself. So the Prophet, who was born in 570 AD, is, of course, the greatest authority for Muslims, but also the Quranic revelation, or the words of God, were revealed to him over 23 years. So that has been of interest to me, because why 23 years? That's a lot of life with a lot of different people, including war, right? Including marriage and divorce, including stories of biblical prophets, including of things to come. So there's this really, there's a lot that's happening in this communication from the divine to the prophet and then to the community. But we also know about the prophet that he was orphaned at a young age. So his own sense of belonging is kind of moving from person to person in this very tribal society. So that was also very interesting to me. How does someone who kind of latches on to any caregiver end up kind of starting this movement that includes war with family? And at sometimes that felt almost inconceivable to me, like everything that I know about the prophet in terms of his care and his tenderness and the ability to kind of do that seems strange. But then there's this element of even in times of family strife, it's important to do some of that fighting. So my brain wants to go to just reconcile, don't fight. That's my own processing. It would be easier, but then the prophet wouldn't be the prophet, right? And there wouldn't be this faith that I hold dearly and live my life according to. But in his role as messenger, there's this, I think, important story, if we look at it pastorally, that often doesn't get talked about in a lot of Muslim circles, which is the prophet's own struggle with receiving that revelation and how it set him apart from other people, because that's not something that he normally would have wanted to do. And perhaps, might there be this kind of new image for Muslims in chaplaincy, or for Muslim students who are interacting with their chaplain, to kind of to see us as really a part of the campus community. So rather than seeing us first as staff, seeing us as people who are praying with them, maybe leading the prayer or praying alongside them, and truly engaging in ritual because of faith and not because, is a token higher or something like that, but there's actual real relationship there. So given that I'm, at this new campus, I learned about a new translation of the Quran, which is one of the benefits of being at an institution like that. And so I wanted to share a short paragraph from this new translation from the Quran, which is in Arabic, of course, memorized by many, but I hadn't read a translation like this before. So when the first revelation comes to the prophet, it's this kind of really difficult experience of the archangel Gabriel squeezing him in a cave, and the prophet is very frightened. And so he runs home to his wife and he says, I don't know what happened to me. I think something bad might have happened. And so she says, no, you take care of the orphan, you're good to your family. The divine wouldn't trick you like that. And so from then on, there was about a 6-month lag when the angel didn't come back. So in some Islamic tradition, the prophet was so distressed by that, thinking that he had done something wrong to stop this connection between him and the divine, that he dreamt that he cast himself from the same mountain where the angel visited him. So this is like immense, right, pain and difficulty. So with that kind of background in mind, the verse reads, it's known as the emissary believes. The emissary believes in what was revealed to him from his Lord. Likewise, the believers. All believe in God, his angels, his books, and emissaries. They say, we make no distinction between any of his emissaries. We hear and obey and seek your forgiveness, Lord. You are the journey's end. God burdens no soul beyond its capacity. It earns with its deeds and bears its misdeeds. Take us not to task if we forget or transgress. Lord, do not place a burden on us, as you did on those who came before us. Do not burden us with more than we have strength to bear. Pardon us, forgive us, have mercy on us. You are our guide, and help us prevail over those who have no faith. So I've been wrestling with this because it sounds like the prophet himself is having his own conversion experience. And how might we as chaplains be able to uplift that difficulty that we might be experiencing in this in-betweenness, and have that level of both vulnerability but also engagement with students, so that there isn't a sense that it's been all figured out, or that there is a clear path forward, but actually help empower them to do this kind of theological engagement. Because my guess is that most of the students know this verse very well, but have not considered what it means for it to be titled "The Emissary Believes," right? That's the messenger. So of course the messenger believes. The messenger is the one who inspires other people to believe. But it sounds like it was a process. And for some that might be controversial. But to me, this is what I think has been sustaining, which is that it is this shared work, and not something to just kind of tick a box and say, okay, I'm done. Of course, this is a given that we would encourage one another to that kind of hopefulness and faithfulness, but rather it's something that requires work.
So let's open the conversation to the room and to those who are online. What do you come with?
Wonder if you could each speak to what sustains you, particularly when you might experience what I would call a spiritual struggle in the work you do.
That was for all of us, right? Okay.
Relationships and wilderness. The fact that I could call and speak with the children of my goddaughter who are terrified right now because of the rockets, and encourage them to have some fun today anyway. All the relationships I could talk about for sure. It's the relationships. I honestly thought that I might, when I went back in May, that I might be so disgusted by the whole situation, I would never want to go back. And situation's pretty disgusting, and I don't want to go back to that, but the people sustain me. And I wouldn't have answered this question. I would have answered this question differently a few weeks ago, but I just spent a week wandering in the wilderness in Utah. And there was a moment where there was one voice in me that was saying, go home, you'll feel safer, you'll have your four walls, you'll have your regular life, you'll have less anxiety, it'll be, as opposed to just being out here in the wilderness and whatnot. And then I had this experience of, I felt more relaxed and secure and connected to the source of life, camped by the Colorado River, than I would ever feel in Denver. So that's a little one for me.
Yeah, I think for me, there's some wisdom in a therapeutic approach that says sometime in the face of struggle, you should actually do the very opposite thing that your stress is telling you to do. Like when stress is telling you to withdraw, do the opposite action, is what it says in that approach. And I love that, because in the midst of struggle and stress, it can so shape our ways of thinking, our ways of behaving. It takes on a kind of rationale of its own, and that can become a really dangerous thing, because questions that would need to be asked aren't asked, because the answers seem self-evident in the midst of that crisis. So there's something sort of wonderfully, I don't know, sort of, I guess, literally counterintuitive, right, to the sort of the intuition of, I'm so stressed out, I'm in such pain. But to not be so enthralled by that teacher as to believe it whole cloth, but instead to say, well, maybe I'll just do the opposite and see how that goes. Because sometimes what that offers us are these breakthroughs where we acquire some evidence to the contrary, right? So it's that sort of being contrary. And again, sometimes we need that kind of mischief to be able to do effective work. Because there's so much within our institutions that just saturate the environment with, it's always going to be this way. It's always been this way. This is the way we do things here. And sometimes we just need a little bit of contrariness, a little bit of what Dr. King called being dissatisfied, be unsatisfied in the face of this stuff. I think that's sometimes the way through for me.
For me, it's a long conversation with someone who's known me for a long time. As an introvert, I will book that, and then 5 minutes before, I will think, can I get out of this? Can I get out of this? But most of the time, what ends up happening is in those 5 minutes, I have to distill what's going on, and then present that as faithfully as possible, and then be open to hearing the voice of the divine from that loved one and saying, hey, that you glossed over that, and that sounds like an important thing. And then that kind of just, hits the brakes for me and says, hey, there's a lot of internal emotional stuff happening that I'm not getting the opportunity to process. And so I find that to be very important, but also very demanding. But I think it also opens up this kind of relational theology that's very meaningful, particularly with people who are not currently in the same context. I think that openness is stabilizing in a way that just talking with folks who are in the same context can kind of be like an echo chamber. So I find that very meaningful.
Other questions?
If the question sounds half-baked, it's because it's only halfway thought through. In all three of your spiritual paths, you are primarily a philosophy of peace. Maybe Steve needs to correct me on that a little bit, but I don't believe so. We ask, in all three faiths, we ask soldiers to fight. Is that asking them to step outside of their faiths? And to a degree, I think that's true, because we wind up with what Larry Graham and Carrie Doring called moral injury when we fight. And then the chaplains do what they can to help with that. When they go back to their churches, and I'll stick with the Christianity right now. When we go back to our churches, are the veterans getting what they need in the church, where almost always when they're preaching on Sunday, they essentially skip right over the moral injury?
How much time do we have?
At least that's a good question.
It's an important question. The experience that I had as a military chaplain, one of the things that was very immediately visible to me is that the experience of identity formation that military service members experience through their training and through their experience is far surpasses what they've experienced in terms of religious formation. So the notion that I could have gone to church and been taught about a Prince of Peace, and now the Marine Corps is asking me to do something that Jesus wouldn't have me do, that's not as competitive a fight as what you describe. Whenever I talk to serious religious folks about military training and the deep identity reformation that takes place as a part of military training, talking to monks and Catholic priests and folks who've spent years preparing themselves to do this kind of important servant leadership work. And they're like, you did what in 6 weeks? Because what in fact that training experience is preparing our people to do is not just a mechanized thing. It's like a deep inner engineering that allows you to see the world and be in the world and act in the world in some different ways. One of the gaps that opens up for a lot of folks when they come home is that while they've experienced some things that may have been deeply traumatizing, they've also experienced a depth of connection that is often very profound. And one of the dangers in going home to church that I've heard again and again from folks who've made that transition is these church folks aren't really connected very deeply. And what I know about belonging and what I know about community that I've experienced in this deep way, I'm not really feeling that sitting here in the church. And so it kind of can be a different kind of moral injury, not one that was experienced during service, but one that is occurring now coming home, anticipating, looking for, needing community to rise to that occasion and being surrounded by folks who could take it or leave it.
Thank you. We have a question from our online viewers.
This question reads, if anyone in the room is connected to DU for Palestine students, perhaps Rabbi Stephen, who beautifully organized and sustained a 21-day encampment at our neighbor school, Denver University, would you please share with the room how they, DU for Palestine, a group of interreligious, interracial students, incorporated various religious services and spiritually based actions? And as a follow-up, why was Iliff not more present to support DU Jewish, Palestinian, and Native students as they were targeted by the DU administration for advocating freedom? Why weren't we as Iliff interreligious community and as chaplaincy leaders more present with our neighbors at DU in April?
Well, first of all, I don't have a personal connection at DU or Iliff with the students. But I missed the first part of the question. I couldn't hear you. Can you say the first part again?
Yeah, absolutely. The first part was if anyone could speak directly to the way in which DU for Palestine organized an interreligious, interracial, spiritually based action and a series of religious services. So it's really asking if there's anyone here who can speak directly to that, and maybe they thought you might.
Well, that could easily take me off into a direction I'm going to resist in terms of wanting to know. I don't know anything about when you say DU students for Palestine. The question that raises to me is, there's only one side. We're only in favor of one side. And so that could take us off in a whole nother direction. I don't personally do one-sided stuff, including the side people think maybe that I'm on. I really think we're all being pushed to take sides. And I don't think taking sides is a great idea, unless we're taking the side of peace or the side of humanity or the side of everybody living in peace and justice. But if I can tie that to your question, Dr. Butler, before about what could happen on campus, what strikes me is two quick things. One is I was in this room with Dr. Vincent Harding at a presentation he was doing, and there was a conversation going on about, using scripture to teach the highest values of humanity or something. I don't remember the specifics. But I remember asking him, wait a minute, you could use scripture to justify just about anything, including some pretty disgusting things. So what do you mean? What do you really mean here? And he said something very profound. He said, let me be clear. Any interpretation of scripture from any tradition that dehumanizes the other, that makes some other not the child of God, that's not what I'm talking about. That's not the religion or the spirituality that I would profess. So my concern on campuses is, when you were describing, the police versus the students and so on, is this push to take sides and dehumanize the other. That's the danger, and I think, from what I've heard, there's been some successful efforts to be a presence that affirms the humanity, the dignity of all. And I take that back to Genesis 1:27, one of the most important lines in the Torah to me, which says, it essentially says all humans are created in the image of God. It doesn't say Jews. It doesn't say men. It doesn't say straight people. It's all humans are created in the image of God. So my challenge, and the challenge that I share, and also part of what sustains me, is I've always got to hold that up. So how do I maintain the child of God status of myself? That's really key. But also, how do I maintain that status for the other? And so my worry on campus is not that there's protests. Come on, I'm a kid of the 60s, but that we lose the humanity of the other somehow in that process.
One of the things these conversations is endeavoring to do is to lift up that none of these encounters, engagements, conversations that are being had, statements that are being made are straightforward and singular. They are all complex, and there are differing interpretations of many of the statements that are being made. So when the question comes from our online presence, I was contacted by one of the local rabbis asking me what I knew about the happenings next door, because there was a statement that was circulating that was going to speak against some of what was happening on DU's campus. And before they chose to sign on or not to sign on, they wanted some conversation with someone who was either on the ground or closer to on the ground. And so we had conversation online for this person to be able to reflect on what their response needed to be, because what was coming to them didn't seem to be an accurate or appropriate characterization of the dynamics of the communities. And I'm saying communities plural. And so we really do have to ask questions each and every time there is a solicitation, an invitation. We have to be willing to engage in conversation. And the way that particular conversation ended was for us, the two of us, to say that we are available to come to community to have open discussion and dialogue on these complex issues, and then to strategize what a better step might be than that invitation that this rabbi received. So I'm encouraging us to look critically and to engage in conversation that leads to action and not retreat. As Dr. Moon was sharing, that, it might be this instinct, this inclination, but how do we actually move forward? How do we engage in meaningful action? And that's one of the challenges we've had here at Iliff. We don't want to keep talking. We want to do some action, but it has to be an action that is followed by deep reflection. I say that as a theologian.
Sounds like there's one more question from online. I think we probably have time for.
Yes, this question, if you can hear me, asks if you could please discuss briefly the importance of public statements from chaplains and showing up during forthcoming protests as a united front in an effort to protect human dignity.
I love the idea of showing up as a united front to protect human dignity. Most of what I hear is more one-sided than that. So I would be much more interested in something like that. I'm not aware of what that is. And what was the first part of the question again?
If you could discuss your thoughts on the importance of public statements from chaplains.
Boy, that's really complicated because there are students on campus who are terrified for different reasons, and they need public figures to speak up in support of them, to help them feel safe, to help them feel like somebody's thinking about them, that they're not alone, that there's higher up powers in the institutions that are going to advocate for them. That's the one-sided thing, but it's also important on that level. And on the other hand, I think it would be really different if we stood up as leaders, as the second part of the question said, and as together and said, we stand for human dignity. We stand for the end of violence. All humans are created in the image of God. Anything that you're doing that denigrates another image of God is not okay. That's got to stop. And then there's deeper, there's that deeper conversation I think you're referring to, is that, well, we also at a certain point have to understand histories, have to understand intergenerational trauma, also have to understand the people who are out there who are doing really good work across boundaries of difference right now, especially in the Middle East, which is not that much known about. But there's a lot of people doing really good work across the boundaries that we think that can't talk to each other. Yeah.
Other responses to that question?
I think one of my commitments is to show up even if it goes badly. And that's not to say that that's what I would like to see at a campus protest or encampment, but because being there and then being able to process with students afterwards is really important. There's a lot of fear, as has been named, student side, administration side, staff side. So part of what's happening that I've been observing is chaplains are trying to absorb some of that, but chaplains have their own anxieties about how best to show up and how best to be helpful. In an ideal situation, we would be talking about this without there being, critical incidents happening all of the time. So I think there's something about speaking to a moment of urgency, but also acknowledging that we don't have everything figured out so that we can plan more so for the long term relationally. And I think that is what's really live for me right now.
Chaplain Safi, Chaplain Moon, Chaplain Booth-Nadav, we thank you for your presence this evening and for helping us to think more deeply about what it means to be a chaplain on the ground in times of crisis and trauma. Thank you very much.